Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I'm Catherine Marshall, speaking from Washington, D.C., from the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University. Welcome to this webinar, which is focusing on a host of interconnected and very complex challenges that face today's world that will be very central to the meeting of the G20 Interfaith Forum, which is taking place in Bologna because Italy is the host of the G20 this year on September 12 to 14. And then at the G20 Leaders Summit, which takes place at the end of October. These topics will also be very central at the World Bank IMF meetings in mid-October and countless discussions in between, including, of course, the UN General Assembly. They are perennial issues, but also ones that are aggravated and accentuated by the COVID crisis. So the core question today is how religious communities are involved in this set of global discussions, advocating, reacting, and acting. There's special issues that turn around inequalities among nations, but also within nations, which of course brings us to a central preoccupation, which is the most vulnerable people. The Joint Learning Initiative, the executive director, Kirsten Muth, is representing that there, and the Berkeley Center and the World Faiths Development Dialogue have been, as many of you know, tracking in an intensive way the COVID impact on religions and religious reactions on the COVID crisis. So that is another backdrop. But the central issue is debt, financial mobilization, and accountability, looking at strategies, but also at gaps. The G20, why the G20? It has a crisis mandate in global governance, though that mandate has been broadened and is being constantly broadened. But the immediate issues that the G20 leaders face are survival, hunger, health, but they also, we hope, are looking ahead to take advantage of the moment to look at longer-term reforms. So Italy is hosting the 2021 G20 process. Indonesia will be the host in 2022, and India actually in 2023, which will come faster than we can imagine. So we're looking at how the agendas are being framed, and within that context, what are the roles of religious and interreligious organizations? A brief housekeeping reminder that I'm sure everyone is very familiar with. This meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be available soon on the Berkeley Center website and possibly on the other websites as well. Encourage you to make comments and to raise questions as we discuss. In many ways, this event is a teaser. It's to provide information and put the issues out. And I will note that we are already looking to another event later down the road that will look perhaps in more detail at the kinds of broad reforms that we're hoping for. So I have three wonderful colleagues and leaders in this field. Adam Taylor has a special role in the US government. He's one of the first people to be appointed to continue the interesting and complex story of religious engagement by the US government. But he also has a long history that he will bring into this, I'm sure, including with the One campaign, which has been a leader in underscoring the issues involved. Kirsten Muth, who leads the Joint Learning Initiative, which I'm sure she will mention, has a broad experience with different kinds of religious roles in advocacy and action. And Eric LeConte is the fearless and tireless leader of Jubilee USA, a person who is deeply involved in the specific issues, and I would also say in the negotiations around them. In other words, not only the ideals, but also the influence that many leaders, including from the religious worlds, can bring. He and I worked together on an interesting event with the largest interfaith organization, Religions for Peace, on similar issues. So I know that he has an extraordinarily deep field of knowledge, but also a great capacity to bring that together in effective ways. So let me start first with Kirsten. I know you may want to introduce some of the issues, but I think we want to have the context here of what are you learning and hearing about the COVID impact on poverty? Statistics, but even more the lived realities. And how do you see the impact on religious communities and the ways in which they're responding?
Thanks, Catherine. So just briefly, as hopefully all of you will know, the Joint Learning Initiative is a collective effort to advance the evidence and research about the role of religion and faith actors in achieving development, humanitarian peace building, and human well-being. So over the past 8 years, the organization has been very much focused on presenting a collective picture of that faith perspective and that impact, and largely led by our members and some of the work that they've done collectively. In the recent year, we have really taken a look at within our own organization of how the body of work that we've done can better reflect the sort of our partners that are more living on the ground with these issues. The whole issue of, some call it localization, I call it expanding the leadership table. It's what we call our Fair and Equitable Initiative, which is really an investment in sort of shifting the center of gravity of our work to advance voices of less heard partners and actors. Having said that, I also want to acknowledge that many of our members are doing this work very well. And I think one of the challenges that we have in this space is sometimes how siloed some of these conversations go. And the more I did reading on this particular topic, the more I realized, how specialized some of this is, and how, a question came to me is how much of the topics, for example, that Eric works in on such depth, how do we make that kind of conversation more accessible? How do we actually advance what we all agree is better participation, more meaningful input into the agendas that affect people's lives. So having said that, I think that JLI right now is really committed to trying to organize our work in ways that do that in alliance with our members and with the other networks that do similar work. What I continue to look at is, how we can be more effective. And we have a lot of different networks. We have a lot of different focal points, a lot of different focal areas. For me, we can't really talk about COVID and poverty without also talking about climate. And I know the title of this is COVID, but the two issues are just immediately and inextricably linked. So as we look at these financing mechanisms, and for me, it's a privilege to be on this call with Eric, who is sort of the leader and the prophetic voice in this field. And it's been a real delight to see the input on the SDRs and all of the work that you've done, and just the momentum and the impact that the Jubilee Network has had. And I wonder, as we go through this conversation, a question I have is, how do we activate like the JLI network? Because some of our members are part of the Jubilee Network, and maybe on a more kind of country-based perspective, how do we spread the information awareness engagement with what you're working on, to really even broaden your network and how it influences. So on how it influences policy. So without, there's a couple of areas that I find particularly interesting in this conversation, but I will, I think, stop there for the moment.
Great. Thank you. Well, let's turn to Eric. Eric, maybe you should start with telling us what Jubilee USA is, without the 2-hour presentation of its history. And what do you see as the immediate challenges, including why focus on the G20 and why religion? I know you have particularly focused with the Catholic Church, but perhaps with the sort of broader interreligious world, as well as some of the specific institutions.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And Catherine, really thanks to you and Georgetown's Berkeley Center for taking so much leadership in this moment, knowing how crucial it is for us to be informed about issues facing the G20. And it's just so great to be here with Kirsten and Adam today. In terms of what is Jubilee USA? Who are we? So we began in the mid-1990s, and it became really out of a call of major religious leaders. And it was a call to confront a major crisis that the world was facing, that developing countries were struggling with. And that was debt. That was the reality that most developing and poor countries in the 1990s were paying more on debt payments to other governments around the world, often debts that were contracted in ways that were illegal or not used for right purposes. They were paying more on debt than they were paying on healthcare, social services, education, and food for their people combined. So it's why during this moment in time, there was a popular saying that was moving around the world in this movement that was saying debt means death. But it was the reality that people were suffering severely because resources were being taken away to pay an external debt. In 1997, Pope John Paul II made a call at World Youth Day, where the Catholic Church and all Christian churches were experiencing the year 2000, the Jubilee, 2,000 years since the birth of Christ. They were gathering to say, well, if we really look at what Jubilee means in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Christian scriptures, also looking at similar teaching in Muslim communities as well, if we really look at what that concept means, we need to add it to be a part of the Jubilee year. And so part of what we read in the Hebrew scriptures, what's reiterated when Jesus begins his actual first public act, where he actually quotes the Jubilee scripture in the Gospel of Luke. When he goes to the synagogue, he, as was the tradition, he unrolls the scroll and he reads from Isaiah that all slaves will be set free, and that he was declaring the great year of the Lord's favor, which at that time, what it meant was every 7 years times 7 years, 50 years was the great Jubilee year, where we would return to our ancestral homes, we would set slaves free, we would forgive debts, and we would all be protected from having too much or too little. So that's the real tradition that's a part of it. And it's why in the 90s, as this debt crisis was facing developing countries, we saw major religious leaders like the Pope and Jewish and Muslim leaders start to speak out. This culminated in a movement to really focus on debt cancellation. And because of that, we've seen more than $130 billion of debts canceled in the developing world, which has meant that 54 million kids have gone to school and continue to go to school in Africa who never would have seen the inside of a classroom. It means that health services were opened in Tanzania. Later, it meant that during the Ebola crisis, debts could be canceled so that people could have access to health care in the 3 West African countries that were affected. As our movement grew, our interfaith movement that also includes environmental groups, advocacy groups, labor unions with religious leaders out front, as the movement grew and we looked at what was happening with the global financial system, as well as the Bible, the scripture on the other hand, and we really looked at what Jubilee means, it actually is a profound assessment of living in a world free from inequality and free from extreme poverty. So when you look at that in terms of a reality, it means that not only are debt policies important, but so are trade policies, so are health policies, so are tax and transparency and anti-corruption policies, because we believe that by shifting and working on these policies, we can create a real jubilee in modern times where we're all protected from having too much or too little. So that's kind of the backdrop of our work over the last 25 years. During the 2008-2009 financial crisis, we saw up until now one of the most significant financial crises we had experienced since the Great Depression. And that particular crisis mobilized a lot of world leaders to look at what are the problems with the global economic and financial system. What are the debt problems? What are the tax problems, the transparency problems? And for the 4 or 5 years that followed the financial crisis, we saw a lot of movement in terms of addressing these structural issues, with, again, religious leaders at the forefront calling for change to protect the most vulnerable. I think, unfortunately, as we talk about the question that Catherine asked about the G20 and where we're at now, we had incredible momentum where we moved forward a lot of good policies on relief, aid, and transparency. But unfortunately, some of the most significant policies were never fully implemented around debt restructuring, around transparency and tax issues. And I think one of the real sad challenges that we're experiencing right now is, had we been successful in implementing these policies before the current pandemic, we likely would not be experiencing as extreme of a crisis as we actually are. And so that puts us right in front of the G20 right now. And I think the reality that we are all aware of, whether we like it or not, that over the next several years, the most important decisions around the global economic crisis that we're going to continue to experience, these decisions will be made by the G20, by the International Monetary Fund. And it's also a range of other decisions that people may not be expecting will be made by these entities. We actually believe some of the most important decisions on climate change will not be made at COP26. They will not be made as a part of the United Nations. They're going to be made over the next few years as a part of the G20, International Financial Architecture Group. They're going to be made at the International Monetary Fund. So it's really important that I think we're having this webinar today because we need to be looking at where the actual decisions around poverty, inequality, and protecting our planet are going to be made in the next 3 to 5 years. And they're going to be made at the G20.
Great, thank you, Eric. That's, I think, a galvanizing set of comments about what it is we're talking about. Adam, you have come to these issues by various routes. So I think it would be interesting for you to talk a little bit about your personal engagement, but also you're now sitting in USAID, which has such important responsibilities. So many, it's hard even to keep track of the different crises that you must be facing in your inbox every morning. But maybe you could start a little bit with a personal comment and then about the USAID aspects of it.
Sure thing. Thank you so much, Catherine. And I'm really delighted to be here with Kirsten and Eric. JLI and Jubilee have been really important, influential bodies of the broader community in terms of my own formation and development, in terms of thinking about these issues, as well as taking action and providing leadership where I can. My name is Adam Nicholas Phillips. I'm the director of the Center for Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships and of the Local Faith and Transformative Partnership Hub at USAID. Prior to joining USAID, I spent my career as a pastor and a grassroots advocate, where I sought to champion inclusion and service to and with the poor. Through my work at the One Campaign, World Vision, Bread for the World, many other faith-inspired initiatives, I've witnessed the tremendous impact that religious leaders and faith-based organizations can have in healing communities in need. At USAID, I want to champion that work by continuing the 20-year legacy of the agency's faith-based office to build bridges between the federal government and faith communities. Working at the intersection of faith and action has given me the extraordinary privilege to forge relationships with humanitarians, activists, and development professionals across the religious and political spectrums. I've seen firsthand that we can do amazing things together. I'm inspired not only by these acts of inclusion, but courageous acts of unity. Partnership offers us the chance to model a new paradigm that, embracing pluralism and advancing development goals, we can help address the devastating impacts of today's development and humanitarian challenges in our nation and in our world. Turning to the topic of today's event, I want to share the various ways in which the US government will work with faith-based organizations to reduce the secondary impacts of COVID-19, such as the resulting increase in poverty, the impact on children in adversity, and food and nutrition insecurity. On August 3rd, President Biden shared that the US has donated and shipped more than 110 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines to over 60 countries, which is more than all other countries combined. Administrator Power announced on August 4th that approximately $720 million in new funding from the American Rescue Plan will be used to strengthen the fight against COVID-19 internationally and assist in global recovery. We need to continue to focus on the global effort against COVID-19 because we cannot fully recover, much less build back a better future for the American people until the pandemic is over everywhere. Since its inception, and even now with the spread of the Delta variant, USAID and our partners recognize its deadly nature, but also its horrific effects on the evolving global landscape. As my boss, Samantha Power, says, COVID was like a meteorite that hit that set back so many of our efforts around the SDGs and other development initiatives that we've got much more work to do now more than ever. While it appears that the global economy will continue to improve in coming months, COVID-19 has caused unemployment to skyrocket, increasing the income gap and pushing millions into poverty. Global extreme poverty, defined as living on less than $1.90 a day, is expected to rise for the first time in 20 years as the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed an estimated 119 million to 124 million people into extreme poverty in 2020. This setback alone jeopardizes the global goal to end poverty by 2030. Without significant and substantial action, the global poverty rate could be around 7% in 2030. This pandemic has created serious risks to the safety and well-being of children, including impacts on their health and education outcomes, as well as an increased risk of violence, child abuse, exploitation, neglect, psychosocial distress, and trauma, all of which can potentially have lifelong effects. USAID is working to address this through increasing child protection, positive parenting, and family strengthening interventions to not only improve outcomes for children, but also mitigate the negative impacts of COVID-19 on both health outcomes and economic recovery. As outlined most recently in a Lancet article, approximately 1.5 million children have lost a parent or caregiver to COVID-19. These figures are grim reminders that the effects of the virus will impact the general population for many years to come. However, the vast majority of these children have a surviving parent or caregiver, and it is critical to provide economic and social support to them, rather than rushing to institutionalized care solutions. This support is also critical for extended family members, or what we might call kinship carers, who take in children when both parents have died. Far too many children end up in orphanages because of poverty, not because they lack living adult family members who love them. USAID has collaborated with international organizations and child protection NGOs to develop guidance on how to identify children in need of care and arrange family care for them. You can find relevant guidance as well as numerous resources on supporting children who have lost a parent or caregiver because of COVID through the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action. We can provide that link later in this event. I do want to say one thing about nutrition as well, as my colleagues in the agency have reminded me. COVID-19 threatens to reverse a decade of global nutrition programs and has put millions more lives at risk. Current projections estimate that by 2022, an additional 13.6 million children will suffer from wasting or acute malnutrition, and 3.6 million more children will face stunted growth that limits their lifelong potential. The additional burden of childhood malnutrition and child mortality could result in future productivity losses of 29.7 billion. As the world looks to rebuild from the economic impact of COVID-19, it cannot afford this immense loss in productivity. I want to close by saying this, and then maybe we can get to a conversation here. With these realities come a sense of hopelessness and despair in the international community, but we recognize the long road ahead of us then we are determined to work as efficiently as possible with local communities and leaders. FBOs and leaders are embedded in the areas that need the most humanitarian assistance, and as such should be engaged to tackle these challenges. To that end, my office is in the process of creating the first of its kind faith engagement policy. It will build upon the agency's efforts to strengthen the evidence-based and religious engagement and development, and ensure we work with individuals and organizations embedded in local communities to create sustainable solutions. It will also strengthen our relationship with mission staff on the ground, as well as between the missions and faith communities in the region. I'm really honored to be part of this event. USAID is honored to lean in with these partners here, and I look forward to this continuing conversation in the half hour ahead.
Great, thank you, Adam. We're reminded quite often, I think, of the Chinese character for crisis, which has danger and opportunity as the two elements. And I think it's the time now is a very vivid reminder of the suffering and the dangers and uncertainties we face, but also of this possibility of doing things better and taking advantage and never waste a good crisis. So Kirsten, we talk a lot, there's this phrase that's been quite used, build back better, but we also say build back fairer, build back greener, build back whatever. As you look ahead, what are some of the critical issues that you see? And by the way, I do want to remind everyone, the Q&A box is right on your screen, and don't hesitate to make comments and to raise questions, which we'll try to get to. And if not, we'll get to them later. So Kirsten.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Adam and Eric, for your inputs. Just a couple of thoughts in listening to you. Obviously we've seen the rollback on the gains that we had made to date in some of the sustainable development goals, the increase in poverty, the reductions in health impacts, and so on and so forth. And, when I listen to that and I think about building back better, I think about being very conscious that we don't embed ourselves in a very project-based, a very nutrition. This is what we're going to do with nutrition. This is what we're going to do with agriculture. For me, when I look at building back better, I think one of the really important areas that we need to invest in is accountability. There have been a number of commitments that have been made about investing in what we call local actors, be they local, national, and again, all the diversity within that. And there hasn't been, some of the faith actors have been very, very strong in advancing this. The Charter for Change, for example, and it lists some specific indicators for advancing local voice, local leadership, and local agenda. The Grand Bargain, I did a little bit of research on, we're behind on making all of those commitments. And I think as we build back better, there really needs to be a really intentional focus in not just the specific sectoral needs, the health, nutrition, agriculture, all of those things which are important, but also real investment in accountability mechanisms that really show how power is being shifted, really show how leadership is being shifted. Even on this call, for example, the next time we have this call, there's a number of people that are listening to this call that should be on this call, that should be speakers, and I hope that they'll speak up in the session. So when I look at how are we actually going to invest in, we see for example, we see a trend in philanthropy to invest in more unrestricted ways. How do we look at risk? I look at some of the funding mechanisms that private investors have invested in terms of funding the famine warning systems and so on and so forth. And those private financial investments are set up in ways that protect the financial investors. How do we shift how we perceive risk in some of these financial tools? I think the world has demonstrated that it is quite capable, as it responded to the global financial crisis of 2008, of mobilizing when they want to. And I look at Jubilee in some of your own reports, how the SDRs, half of them remain with the wealthier countries. How will those be reinvested? So there's for me, the interesting points are basically how we strengthen the accountability mechanisms for making sure that we're getting different voices, that we're getting different inputs into changing and living into those policies. And I think that there's a real room for some learning mechanisms about these tools. I mean, finance and economics can be very, very complicated. And I think we need to make it more accessible for people to be able to participate in the conversations, strengthen those accountability mechanisms, in addition to building back better in terms of the let's call them the technically specific sectoral areas.
Yeah, that's an important point. And one of the lessons I learned from many years working at the World Bank is that if you can't explain it to your grandmother, there's a problem. But could we turn to Eric? And I think one thing that's come out from all three of you so far, and it's also part of my my ethos, is the moral imperative that comes from the religious voices of what is right, what is just, what is fair, what is equitable. But Eric, maybe you could step back a little bit and just give us a very quick sense of what the G20 maybe has already done, but what it can do and what the Jubilee campaign is focusing on for this very immediate future. And even maybe hint, because that would take you too long for our short webinar, which is just a teaser, what you see looking ahead.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. And perhaps it might be helpful in responding to that question to offer a little bit of information of what our world was facing before the pandemic, then what we faced at the pandemic, and now how the G20 is involved in all of this. So before the pandemic, before it was announced by the World Health Organization that we were dealing with a global health crisis, and then the International Monetary Fund noted shortly after we were now dealing with a major global financial crisis on par with the Great Depression. Before that happened, before we faced this pandemic, things were not great in the developing world. And I think what both Kirsten and Adam have highlighted is in part how the pandemic has made a lot of things worse. So what was our world like before the pandemic struck? Well, 22,000 kids, according to UNICEF, under the age of 5 were dying every single day. Now that number's higher. 22,000 kids under the age of 5 every single day around the world were dying because they didn't have access to healthcare, proper nutrition, and they were living in poverty. Before the pandemic hit, more than half of the world's developing countries were either dealing with severe debt crisis, dealing with unsustainable debts, or not being able to pay their debts. And again, we were in the same situation we were back in the 1990s, where again, we had many countries that were paying more on their debts, debts that had now become more complicated in the last 20 years, were paying more on debt than they were paying on healthcare, social services, and education. Before the pandemic hit, the developing world was losing $1 trillion a year because of tax evasion, corruption, tax avoidance. Before the pandemic hit, developing countries were struggling with trade agreements that weren't fair, that took away rights for developing countries to be able to feed their people, to be able to access vital medicines. If these issues had been addressed before the pandemic, we would be on a much better footing, but they weren't. Then the pandemic struck, and then what happened? Well, and I hate to offer these statistics because they're even going to be worse tomorrow, but according to the World Bank, 150 million more people will enter the ranks of extreme poverty this year. That's incredibly significant. We're also looking at the reality that now 265 million people are experiencing famine for the first time. 400 million jobs have been completely wiped off. To put that at, just in perspective with the 2008-2009 crisis, we lost 40 million jobs. So now, according to the International Labor Organization, more than 400 million jobs are going to be lost. The pandemic also exacerbated these crises in some ways, the most significantly, where we see the most significant job loss, the most significant famine increases, these are in developing so-called middle-income countries, the majority of countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And many of the decisions in front of the G20 right now and the policies being debated have left this huge swath of developing countries out. Now, the US government has been a real leader in saying we need to include middle-income countries, and they've been out front in the G20 saying we need to do more, which is incredibly exciting. But what does all this information mean now in terms of what the G20 is considering? So there's short-term as well as the more long-term questions that Catherine alluded to. But we believe in the upcoming G20 meetings that'll take place in October, we're dealing with some very serious make or break decisions on addressing poverty, climate inequality, as well as global health care. So one of those major decisions that needs to be done this year is on vaccine distribution. And the G20 has a very special role in figuring out the financing and aid to make that happen. They didn't make the decision over the summer. And so now we're in a make or break moment for their meetings in October. Around debt relief, which has been very significant and is absolutely crucial for so many of the developing countries that are suffering so they can get back on a better footing. We've seen some real advancements in the G20, again, some great leadership from the US government in terms of pushing forward solutions that can cancel and cut debts. While these processes are moving forward, the common framework, which I think is very exciting and can actually help us change how the financial system operates in the future. Right now, it only includes the poorest low-income countries and leaves out the middle-income countries that are experiencing some of the most significant hardships. So that's a big question coming up for the G20 this October, both around expanding that policy, but also ensuring that these kinds of policies on debt relief do cut enough debt. Similarly, we're also looking at some big trade decisions that the G20 is going to weigh in on, that the World Trade Organization is going to make. And that has to do with developing countries being able to access, produce, and distribute vaccines by having a temporary patent waiver on the COVID vaccines. Again, an issue that the Biden administration has been really outspoken about. We're also dealing with tax and transparency issues. And this is the reality when we talk about the developing world losing $1 trillion a year because of tax evasion, corruption, and tax avoidance. We're on the cusp of a global tax agreement, which will also be moving forward in October, which can bring in more revenue. Had developing countries had revenue before the crisis, they would not be facing such a significant crisis. So these are the immediate critical decisions on debt that are going to be taking place, on healthcare, as well as tax and transparency. We also know that decisions on climate finance and climate change are also going to move forward. So these are the critical decisions that the G20 is really in the driver's seat to make this coming October. Now, beyond that, the big teaser from Catherine is now the Indonesians. Indonesia will take over the presidency of the G20 next year. And we believe that's going to be the time where we're moving towards a conversation on international financial architecture. What are the big changes that need to be made in the financial system to prevent the next crisis from happening, whether it's spurred by a pandemic, a housing bubble, or another economic shock? Over the next few years, starting with the Indonesian presidency, we need to be putting in place these policies to prevent future crises, to protect the vulnerable, and to be able to protect our planet.
Yeah, well, I think everyone will have the daunting sense that those of us putting together the agenda for the September interfaith meeting in Bologna, the extraordinary numbers of issues that face the world, and the complex ways in which the religious communities are directly involved as advocates, but also hands and hearts, trying to build the kinds of consensus that we know we need. Adam, these are, of course, all issues that come across your emails, your meetings these days, but there is one specific question that you might also address in sort of taking us to the next stages, which is a very specific question that's come in about the Biden administration and this critical issue of vaccines and making vaccines, because we all know, I think that sort of it's a real tension between, is climate change more important or is the vaccination what you really want people to act on? But that clearly is an issue. So I'll just leave you to navigate some of these questions as you respond.
Sure thing. And I appreciate what's already been said and share so much of the same sentiment. When we think about the crises at hand, we're looking at an unprecedented amount of crises all at once. And there seems to be an interconnected relationship to these crises. And certainly when we think about the pandemic, we must think about all of the secondary effects I was mentioning earlier. And that's why President Biden, in his executive order back in February, when he reinstituted the faith-based office, it was crucial for him to give us a mandate that focused on these key challenges around the pandemic, as well as climate change, as well as inequity in the world. And so every day I get up with that lens as I look through the email boxes you said. I mean, this is my I was very happy out west in Portland, Oregon, and moved back to DC with a real sense of purpose to face these crises, because I do think they are opportunities to, and we say it all the time, but to build back better, to dream up a better world and future for so many of us, as our partners in the Vatican told me last month when I was visiting there. So when we think about the vaccine question, I'm really grateful for Laura Peralta Schultz question from Network. Yes, we are working with COVAX and Gavi to ensure that there are a further distribution and a real urgency around that, around the vaccine, as we are also looking at boosters here in this country. These are very complicated matters, and they get to the heart of who we are at USAID. We just lost 2 members of our team in East Africa in the past couple of weeks. And so these are devastating realities. And yet we know that the pandemic's not over here until it's over there, until it's over everywhere. And so we think that we can meet that challenge in terms of boosters and vaccine commitments around the world. And that's what we're going to get up every day as this pandemic continues to affect all of us, and get at the heart of how we can distribute more in as quick a fashion as possible. But yeah, I will say to the effects of climate, this is why I'm very committed to going to Bologna in a couple of weeks to attend the G20 Interfaith Summit. We know that, as Eric said, that core crucial decisions will be made at many of these tables with many multilateral partners. And so we all have a role to play in facing these issues. And so whether it's COVID vaccines, climate action, climate resiliency, ensuring that financial structures are better suited for the future and that we will all inherit. That's why we're showing up at the G20. That's why COP is important. That's why thinking about Indonesia even right now is so important. So that's why we're leaning in where we can.
We have another comment from a colleague from South Africa, Renier Kuglenberg, who basically is expressing his pain and frustration at the situation facing South Africa. That I think is part of the reality that we're facing in country by country, people dying, people suffering, children losing parents, and as you highlighted, Adam, which is a critical issue. Eric, I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball, but there are so many of these groups that are meeting successively. I mean, the G7 now is trying to deal with, I guess today, with Afghanistan. You have the World Bank meetings coming up, the UN General Assembly, you have the G20. I think it's understandably quite a maze for people to navigate. But maybe you could comment a little bit on within the sort of global governance, what do you see particularly as the G20 role? And what I mean, my greatest fear is that we're just going to muddle through as we usually do. And what we hope, of course, is for some bold action. And do you really see that coming from the G20, from some concerted effort of everyone to work together?
Well, that's our hope. And right now, let me say, even though there's a lot more work to do, years of work to do in responding to this pandemic, I'm feeling optimistic. With that said, the decisions that we're facing are not easy. I think what's positive right now is world leaders are sharing a common analysis. They're having a common language at the serious problems in terms of vaccines, debt, trade, tax, and transparency. Now, where I'm concerned is the last time we were in this moment was after the 2008-2009 crisis, which we experienced as a very serious crisis. And even in the United States, we still have communities across the United States that have not returned to work since the 2008-2009 crisis. It was a serious crisis. World leaders took it very seriously. I would offer so did Congress and the US government. But we failed to implement actual solutions to the problems we face. And now we're facing a greater crisis. And again, we're reminded that had we implemented what we had agreed upon in global agreements on tax, on trade, on debt, on preventing financial crisis, we wouldn't be dealing with as serious as of a crisis now. So when we're talking about who makes the decisions, I think that's very important. And I think that's something that we've really tried to look at in terms of what Jubilee USA does and what's our contribution. You know, Jubilee USA, we're a big coalition of major religious institutions from the Lutheran Church, the Catholic Church, American Jewish World Service, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, all of these different groups that are looking at these particular issues from a moral perspective. But what Jubilee does with all these groups is we're trying to focus on the decision makers who are making the actual decisions. So of course, the United Nations is very important, and that's where a lot of consensus building and a lot of decisions are being debated. But where the decisions are being made are the G20, the G7, and the IMF. And this is why what you're convening today is so important. Let me just share with you an experience that I had 4 years ago. Our office at Jubilee USA, we're in the Methodist building across from the Capitol building, really great building, great place with a lot of our partners and members. I walked across the street to the Capitol and I stopped 5 people, 4 of whom worked for members of Congress. And I asked them, what is the International Monetary Fund? 4 out of those 5 people could not give me an answer working for members of Congress. If I ask a 12-year-old in El Salvador, in Zambia, in Grenada, they may not get it exactly right, but they have much better answers than those 4 people who worked for members of Congress were able to offer me. And the International Monetary Fund, in terms of macro policy, a Bretton Woods institution, we believe after the White House is the most powerful institution on planet Earth. That institution has a grasp on the global economy, on our lives, our livelihoods, and our jobs. And unfortunately, too few of us in the North understand what this institution does. And I think that's also similar to the purview of the G7 and the G20. And so part of the reason for us gathering today is to get up to speed really quick, because if we are going to weigh in on these debt, poverty, inequality, trade, tax, transparency, and climate decisions, we need to be weighing in with those that are actually going to be making the decisions. And some of those are made by the G7, some by the G20, some by the World Trade Organization, and the IMF is a part of almost all of it. So it's just really important as we go forward. And if we're going to be successful in actually being able to prevent the next crisis, to be able to reduce inequality and end extreme poverty, to be able to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, it's going to be absolutely crucial that we're focusing on the decision makers where the decisions are being made.
Well, that I think is what we're trying to navigate as we talk here. And we are 10 minutes left. So we're sort of trying to address some of the questions, but also push ourselves to the next set of questions. Kirsten, there is a question from Robert Powell that essentially is looking at the aid world, which is debt, whether it's loans or grants, and what's available. As you think about some of the issues we're talking about today, what do you see as critical points? I know that your focus is not finance usually. You're focused much more on engagement and religious literacy, but also development literacy, which I think comes from what Eric was talking about. What are some of the things you want to do in the next week? You only have a week.
I only have a week. Oh.
No, I'm trying to give you a sense of urgency.
Yes. Well, honestly, I tend to see things in a pretty straightforward way. I think that we've already mentioned that the commitments to the grand bargain and all of those things, and even Eric, when you mention the shortfalls of the response to the 2008 financial crisis, as though may have been, there was also a demonstration of what could be galvanized in the amount of and the kinds of funds that they did create, what they did with those funds, or how they ended up utilizing them fully. But it did demonstrate that given a common sense of the crisis, there was a will to do things. So when I think about the fact that there's a couple things about grant aid. One, I think we still live very much in a project-based world where things are very much driven by donor agendas and sort of Northern and Western kind of results and orients and indicators. I think we really need, and this goes back to my issue of accountability. I think there really needs to be a lot more investment in the actual organizations themselves above and beyond specific projects. And I think there has to be accountability for that. We can't say, oh, the international intermediaries are important because of capacity and ability to negotiate financial agreements and so on and so forth, if we're not actually really making concerted investments into the infrastructure of smaller organizations. And then I think also human capital investments. I think a lot of African-led organizations are really doing some amazing work on youth leadership, youth entrepreneurial development. I think that we really need to lean into sort of these human capital and social capital investments in addition to sort of what I would call more project-based things, which I think sometimes, as effective as they are in achieving some impact in a certain period of time, are not necessarily building the infrastructure for a strong sort of civil society space.
Adam, you were coming to the point where I say we're sort of winding up comments, but one issue that has come out, I think, from everybody here is this issue, the question of accountability. And of course, a question then is, how do religious organizations get involved? And one thing that has struck me is how little religious groups have been involved in some of the integrity movements of the world, Transparency International, et cetera. And I think with the story, the unfolding tragedy in Afghanistan, we're going to hear even more about accountability. So wondered if you haven't been in your job for that long, but if you had any comments on that or on any of the other topics we've been discussing.
No, I think that accountability, transparency are key to the future in terms of how to get us back onto a better road forward. I think we definitely are thinking about Afghanistan today, thinking about Ethiopia as well, thinking about the Northern Triangle, and knowing that faith groups actually in Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala have been key drivers of accountability and transparency efforts in the region. That's why we're really eager to partner with faith-based and indigenous groups as we look for more localized approaches to development. And Kirsten's comments are very timely. We are looking to ensure that any kind of humanitarian assistance to development work is not just program based, but is looking towards this better, more inclusive future that we all have a role to play in seeking. And then I'll just add that when it comes to matters of accountability, transparency, that's why we want to show up here in this new administration to these multilateral settings, to these broader tables where both governments, civil society leaders, activists, and so on and so forth, faith communities are at the table. And that's why we're really eager to develop this policy that I mentioned earlier. And there will be an opportunity for a robust public comment period around that. And I really encourage this group here that's tuning in to lean in and help us get smarter on it. We need accountability as well, and that will help us build the best policy that we can as we engage these critical issues.
We have time only maybe for one more intervention, so I'm going to put to Eric. I think the starting point for this discussion is, first of all, to navigate this very complex set of challenges we face and the complex actors that include all of the national, local, and global institutions. But of course, we're focusing particularly on the religious roles and sort of religion at the table, which is, of course, which religious voices, but also which tables, and what is the most effective way for them to advance the agendas of justice and fairness and equity that we care about. So, Eric, any last comment on where you think we might be going, what you'd like to see?
Sure. Well, let me just respond by also, I think, offering a moment of hope in terms of where we see the positive role of religious leaders being able to move the G20 and the IMF, where there is a lot of work still to do and a lot of work to deal with this current crisis and prevent the next crisis. Because of the mobilization of so many groups, and I would really say at the forefront, religious institutions and religious groups around the world, from the World Council of Churches to the Vatican and others, we have seen some pretty amazing movement. Because of the work that we've all done together, Jubilee USA was able to organize 268 labor unions, environmental groups, and religious institutions, including the largest religious institutions in the world, to call for emergency aid to go to the developing world. This included this number of 268, 211 faith communities, faith institutions, and faith organizations. And this particular type of aid we've been calling for is called special drawing rights. It's an emergency currency that the International Monetary Fund, this powerful institution, can create in times of a crisis, specifically liquidity crisis, that the central banks don't have enough on hand to be able to deal with challenges that they're facing. Because we've called for this aid, yesterday, the International Monetary Fund, after the G20 and the IMF made decisions, essentially created $650 billion of new currency. Yesterday, more than $230 billion in this emergency aid went to developing countries. It's incredibly significant when we look at the reality. That's more debt relief, that's more disaster aid or economic aid than our campaign has won in the last 25 years. And countries are going to be able to use this for healthcare, to prevent crisis, to get people back into jobs. Now, Kirsten alluded earlier that one of the pieces around this is that wealthy countries like the G7 are actually receiving the majority of funds. So that's 280 billion. So part of our work right now as religious institutions, as people of faith and people that care, we need to move those wealthy governments, the G7 governments, to donate that emergency funds, currency they don't need to developing countries. So I think where we want to look at what you're asking, Catherine, is we've seen some tremendous success so far There's a lot more work to do, but I think we should celebrate what the religious community has achieved so far, with our eyes wide open for what we still need to achieve in the months and years to come.
Well, that's I think a very fitting and prophetic voice at the end of this call. I hope everyone will appreciate what I meant at the beginning, that this is really an ongoing conversation. In many ways, the discussion today was an introduction, but also I think a call to attention as well as a call to action. We are at a very critical moment, and these tables that we're talking about, these places where people meet, are where a lot of collective decisions simply have to happen. So I encourage everyone to continue the discussion, and I want to thank all three of you very much for, I think, a very thoughtful, informative and provocative set of exchanges that really cut out our work for us. So thank you all very much.